In episode 64, titled Auth Attack Mini-Scenarios, we're using rapid drills that sharpen identity reasoning and decision choices, because authentication and authorization problems rarely announce themselves in neat categories.
In real work, you get a clue, a constraint, and a limited window to make a safe next move that increases certainty rather than increases chaos.
Identity scenarios are especially tricky because they span multiple layers, such as passwords, MFA prompts, sessions, tokens, and federation trust, and it is easy to chase the wrong layer if you do not slow down and name what you are actually seeing. These mini-scenarios are designed to train the habit of identifying the key flow clue, choosing a minimal safe action, and justifying it in a way that respects boundaries and stability. The point is not to win the scenario, but to choose the next best step you could defend in a report.
When you can do that quickly, you're thinking like a professional under time pressure.
The drill approach is simple. Identify the flow clue, choose an action, and justify safely. The flow clue is the one detail that best indicates which layer is failing, such as lockout behavior, unexpected prompts, token reuse, or wrong role grants. Choosing an action means selecting the smallest step that increases certainty without causing outages, lockouts, or scope violations, because identity work can disrupt real users quickly. Justifying safely means you explain why your action matches policy and phase, why it minimizes harm, and what evidence it will produce that helps you decide what comes next.
You also assume that initial clues can be misleading, so your action should be designed to confirm or refute the hypothesis, not to amplify risk.
This is why the drill includes justification, because you want your reasoning to be explicit rather than instinctive.
Over time, the drill becomes a mental checklist that keeps your decisions consistent when identity systems behave in confusing ways.
Scenario 1 starts with a lockout policy that is known, which is a gift because lockout rules are often the primary safety constraint in credential testing. Imagine you are told the environment locks an account after a small number of failed attempts and that the reset window is long enough to disrupt users for hours. The flow clue is that lockout risk is high and predictable, which immediately makes brute force the wrong approach, because it concentrates many guesses on one account and will almost certainly cause lockout. A spray-style approach is safer in principle because it uses few guesses per account, but even that may be unacceptable if the lockout threshold is extremely low or if the scope does not explicitly permit live guessing against real users. The best decision in a controlled engagement is usually to avoid brute force entirely and, if any guessing is authorized, limit it to minimal agreed test accounts with strict rate controls and stop rules. The point is to match method to policy so you do not prove risk by creating harm, which is not a win in any professional setting.
The other options fail in Scenario 1 for clear reasons, tied to risk, scope, and policy mismatch. Brute force fails because it conflicts directly with a strict lockout policy and will likely cause user disruption, which violates the minimize harm principle. Spraying can fail if you treat it as safe by definition, because broad sprays still create failures across many accounts, can trigger detection, and can cause lockouts if the policy is strict enough or if the guess count is not truly minimal. Credential stuffing can fail if you do not have legitimate authorization and scope for using known credential pairs, and it can also be infeasible if you do not actually possess pairs and would have to manufacture them, which is outside ethical testing boundaries. Another failure mode is choosing any active guessing approach when the rules of engagement forbid it, because no technical rationale overrides authorization. The safe logic is to choose the least harmful path that still demonstrates the risk, often through policy review, control testing, and limited validation rather than broad guessing. When you can state why each alternative fails, you show exam-level judgment rather than tool-level enthusiasm. Scenario 2 involves unexpected approvals appearing, which is a strong clue about MFA fatigue or social pressure.
Imagine a user reports repeated approval prompts arriving on their device, even though they are not attempting to sign in, and the prompts come in bursts that feel like someone is trying to wear them down. The flow clue is that authentication attempts are occurring, and the attacker is relying on user interaction rather than technical bypass, which aligns with fatigue patterns or a social engineering script.
In this scenario, you do not need to prove the attacker's technique first, because the priority is user safety and containment.
The correct inference is that either credentials are being tried elsewhere or an attacker is actively attempting to pressure a user into approving access, and both require a protective response.
This is the identity equivalent of a smoke alarm, where you act to reduce risk first, then investigate the details. The drill teaches you to prioritize user protection over clever validation. The safest next action in Scenario 2 is to protect users and respect boundaries by treating it as an active security event and reducing ongoing opportunity.
You advise the user not to approve any prompts and to report the timing, and you trigger containment actions that do not require risky experimentation, such as revoking active sessions, resetting credentials, and reviewing sign-in logs for unusual sources. You also check whether the MFA method supports stronger challenge designs, such as contextual prompts or number matching, because reducing prompt abuse is both a defensive improvement and an immediate risk reduction.
If the environment allows it, you coordinate with identity administrators to temporarily tighten policies for the affected account or group, such as limiting prompt frequency and enforcing step-up checks for sensitive actions. The focus is on restoring trust in the authentication flow and preventing accidental approval, not on proving the attacker's intent through further prompt generation. This action respects boundaries because it does not require testing against other users and does not create additional authentication noise, which is especially important in production environments. The key is that you choose actions that reduce harm now and produce evidence later through logs and controlled review.
Scenario 3 centers on token reuse granting access, which points toward a session handling weakness rather than a password weakness.
Imagine you observe that a token captured from an authenticated session continues to grant access even after the user logs out, changes their password, or re-authenticates, and the system does not appear to enforce meaningful revocation.
The flow clue is that access persists without re-authentication, which suggests that the system treats possession of the token as sufficient and does not invalidate it when a user expects access to end.
That is a classic session lifecycle gap, where logout is a user interface event, but not a true server-side invalidation event.
In some designs, this can be a deliberate trade-off, but it becomes a security problem when tokens are long-lived, portable, and not bound to context, because replay becomes practical.
The drill teaches you to recognize that the attack surface is post-login trust artifacts, not the initial authentication step. That distinction matters because remediation focuses on token lifetime, revocation, and binding, rather than on stronger passwords.
Evidence to note in Scenario 3 should focus on flow steps, expiration behavior, and access results, because those details explain the weakness without requiring excessive data collection. You document how the token was obtained, such as whether it was exposed in logs, stored insecurely, or captured in a way consistent with the environment, while keeping the description minimal and responsible. You record what happens when the user logs out and whether the token continues to work, because that is the core proof of poor revocation or session invalidation. You note the token's lifetime behavior, such as whether it remains valid until a fixed expiration or whether it can be refreshed, because that determines replay window and persistence risk. You capture the access results in a minimal way, such as confirming a protected endpoint is still accessible without pulling sensitive content. This evidence pattern is enough to justify controls like server-side revocation, shorter lifetimes, and binding. And it stays aligned with safety because it avoids broad extraction. In exam terms, you are proving possession grants access beyond intended boundaries, which is the relevant conclusion. Scenario 4 involves SSO misconfiguration granting the wrong role, which is a strong clue that claim mapping or trust validation is misaligned. Imagine a user authenticates through a federated login flow and receives a role that is higher than expected, such as administrative access in an application where they should be a standard user. The flow clue is that the identity provider successfully authenticated the user, yet the service provider granted an unexpected authorization outcome, which points to a mapping issue rather than a login failure. This can occur when claims are overly broad, when group-to-role mapping is misconfigured, or when the service accepts identity packages that are not intended for it due to weak audience or issuer validation. The key is that the problem is in how identity information is interpreted and enforced, not in whether the user can authenticate. In a safe assessment mindset, you aim to confirm the mapping condition without expanding access beyond what is necessary to prove the issue exists. The drill teaches you to focus on trust and authorization logic rather than on password-level analysis.
Quick wins across these scenarios share a common strategy: focus on least harmful confirmation and clear documentation. You choose actions that confirm the condition using configuration evidence, logs, and minimal controlled checks rather than broad or disruptive testing. You document the clue, the constraint, the chosen action, and the observed outcome so that your reasoning remains defensible and reproducible. You also prefer fixes that reduce attack opportunity quickly, such as tightening MFA prompt behavior, improving token revocation, restricting claim mappings, and enforcing strict validation rules. The quick win mindset is not about speed at any cost. It is about using small, safe steps to clarify reality and drive practical remediation. This keeps identity work from turning into user disruption, which is the most common way these engagements lose trust. Clear documentation also prevents confusion later, especially when multiple identity layers are involved and teams may blame the wrong component. Common pitfalls across identity drills often come from confusing layers, which is easy because passwords, tokens, sessions, and federation all represent proof in different forms. One pitfall is treating every authentication issue as a password problem and ignoring session tokens, which leads to fixing the wrong control. Another pitfall is treating MFA as a guaranteed barrier and missing fatigue, recovery, or session replay paths that route around it. A third pitfall is confusing federation messages with local sessions, which can cause you to blame SSO for what is actually weak local session handling, or to miss a trust validation gap because you are focused on cookies. There is also a pitfall of overreacting to symptoms, such as assuming repeated prompts prove compromise, rather than treating them as a trigger for containment and investigation. The professional approach is to name the layer first, then choose the safest confirmation action that matches that layer. When you do that consistently, your conclusions become cleaner, and your recommendations become more effective. To keep your thinking consistent, use a memory anchor: flow, policy, token, trust, then choose. Flow reminds you to identify where in the authentication journey the clue appears, such as login, approval, session reuse, or role grant. Policy reminds you that lockouts, allowed methods, and user impact constraints shape what you can do safely. Token reminds you that post-login proof is often the real shortcut attackers use, making replay and revocation central concerns. Trust reminds you that federation depends on strict validation and correct claim mapping, so wrong roles often indicate trust configuration gaps. Then choose reminds you to pick the smallest safe action that increases certainty, not the loudest action available. With that anchor, identity scenarios become a structured reasoning exercise rather than guesswork. Many review the scenarios by summarizing each key clue and best action, so the drill pattern becomes instinctive. In Scenario 1, the key clue is a strict lockout policy, And the best action is to avoid brute force and, if authorized, use only minimal, controlled, scope-approved testing on agreed accounts while prioritizing safer validation paths.
In Scenario 2, the key clue is unexpected MFA approvals, and the best action is to protect users by advising against approval, revoking sessions, resetting credentials, and reviewing sign-in telemetry, rather than provoking more prompts.
In Scenario 3, the key clue is token reuse granting access after logout or other expected termination, and the best action is to document expiration and revocation behavior with minimal proof and recommend stronger lifecycle controls.
In Scenario 4, the key clue is a wrong role granted through SSO, and the best action is to confirm claim mapping and validation rules, documenting the authorization outcome, and tightening trust and claim enforcement. Each best action is deliberately conservative because identity systems affect real users and trust relationships, making disruption a high cost.
This review reinforces that the drill is about safe next steps, not maximal exploitation.
To conclude episode 64, titled Auth Attack Mini Scenarios, remember the drill format. Identify the flow clue, choose the smallest safe action, justify it, and revise when evidence changes the picture.
Replay Scenario 2 and justify again as practice. If unexpected MFA approvals appear, you treat it as an active risk signal and prioritize user protection by instructing the user not to approve, revoking sessions, resetting credentials, and examining sign-in logs, because those actions reduce immediate risk without disrupting broader operations.
You avoid creating more prompts or conducting aggressive tests because that increases user pressure and can widen impact beyond authorization boundaries.
You capture minimal evidence from telemetry and policy settings. Then you recommend mitigations like stronger prompt controls, better user guidance, and tighter recovery and step-up enforcement.
When you can justify that sequence calmly, you are applying exactly the identity reasoning this episode is meant to train.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.